Thank you, Bill. I did wonder where you were going with Kermit the Frog for a moment there. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and I would like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and to honour their ongoing custodianship of this place. When I say that I am Genevieve Jacobs from 666 ABC Canberra, that's true in many ways and only partially so in others. I do feel very strong ties with Canberra after broadcasting here for almost a decade. I've come to understand how strong the community is, to see something of how its cross currents eddy and ripple and intersect with one another, to know through the listeners and those I meet, like you here tonight, the character of the place. First to respect it, and then, and I need to admit this to myself, to come to love Canberra. And in many ways, I'm also close to a big part of Canberra's population in that I belong to the rural diaspora of the surrounding southwest slopes and tablelands. And I see a sort of a net slung beneath this place that strings together the people who are not displaced public servants or academics, but those like me who have come into Canberra because they need the life of the city, but they want to stay connected to the bush. And there are lots of us. Not infrequently, somebody says to me, sometimes on radio, I think you might know my Auntie Beryl. You're from Young, aren't you? Often I do know Auntie Beryl too. I am part of one of those large Catholic tribes of Irish who spread out across southern inland New South Wales in search of prosperity and land, always the land. The first of my ancestors, Hugh Byrne, arrived here unwillingly on the Telecherry in 1806. He had been one of the leaders with his brother-in-law, Michael Dwyer, of the 1798 Wicklow Uprising, which failed. They went on the run for 5 years before they were finally offered a deal. Come as prisoners of state, not convicts. You can bring your wives and children, take a land grant, assigned convicts, and this, of course, to a country where Catholicism was viewed at the time with the deepest suspicion. And it's worth remembering that for the first 30 or 40 years of the colony, you could be flogged or imprisoned for speaking in Gaelic. After some ups and downs at the hands of Governor Bligh, who was utterly horrified, and I have seen the letters, that the very worst of these Irish rebels, these benighted men, were being visited upon him. And just decades after being shipped to what might have well been another part of the planet, they prospered, Hugh and Sarah Byrne. Decades after their arrival here, they were making a handsome payment towards St Patrick's on Church Hill. One of their daughters was married in one of the first versions of St Mary's Cathedral. Their sons built fine Georgian villas that still stand today in Campbelltown. My childhood home is on the Bland, far out between Grenfell and West Wyalong, 4 miles from the speck on the map that is Quandialla. And that's a place where the endless sky and the stars overhead span the heavens at night. The grass-tossed plains during the day roll on forever under a blazing, enormous sky. It's a place that is so silent sometimes that you can hear the earth breathing. It's a place where in summer the heat shimmers and it distorts the Gun Straight Road and nothing moves in the blazing light of noon. It's a place where every car on the quiet road belongs to a neighbour. And when, as an adult, I named my third son Gus, no one asked whether he'd been called Angus, because they all knew instantly that he was named for his great-grandfather, Augustus McNamara. My Sunday mornings were spent in St Bridget's Quandialla, a tiny wooden church, beneath the plaster gaze of the saints and the angels, where the varnish stuck you to your pew in January, where one somnolent Sunday morning, as Father Cork droned on and on and on in his sermon, Stan Nowlan stood up at the back of the church and said, "Father, it's been very interesting. I've got 1,000 sheep in the yards waiting to be drenched and they just won't wait any longer." I had an aunt, Sister Mary Angela, who was a Josephite nun, a cousin of Mum's, Sister Bonaventure, who was a Mercy nun. My mother had boarded at the Quandialla convent during the war years, when she and her sisters were made to learn every instrument available because the nuns could keep the fees they earned as music teachers. So the Catholic Church wasn't just church, it was our deeply felt culture. It defined us and it shaped us, and I recognise that culture wherever I meet it. I know my tribe. But I also always understood that I could ask questions. My mother taught me about the primary role of the individual conscience and an intelligent engagement with God on those terms. Ours was a house where the Sydney Morning Herald was devoured every day, where the ABC was another religion, and where books filled the walls. While we were a deeply Catholic family, I went to a tiny little bush school with kids from all kinds of backgrounds, so we didn't live in a bubble. I was never taught that Protestants were different or strange or not like us, they were simply our neighbours. When I went to boarding school in Sydney, I was educated by the Loreto nuns, by women brave and sharp and clear in their courage and their intelligence and their belief that women will do great things in times to come. I recall many years ago talking to Father Kevin Barry Cotter, who was at that stage our parish priest in Cootamundra, who said to me that so often people abandon their faith because they have never moved beyond the most childlike version of God, who is then incompatible with the complexities of adult life. I never felt that my faith was incompatible with asking questions or that it was unable to withstand change. I married a farmer at Wallenbean near Cootamundra, where I still live, and I did spend years on the country newspaper beat, doing the court and police and the Shire Council jobs, working for Australia's Open Garden Scheme and raising 4 children. And I ended up at the ABC, first as a gardening expert of all things. Let me tell you, if any of you remember me in those days, I was making it up as I went along. I had a stack of reference books that high in the studio with me, and if you heard me saying things like, "Have you got the pink cultivar or the purple cultivar?" it meant I was frantically thumbing the index, trying to find out what was wrong with your azalea. And I found myself eventually at my current position as mornings presenter here on 666 ABC Canberra. And it's a dizzying thing to work for the ABC. You come to it with such high dreams and values, and often a fervent belief in what the Australian Broadcasting Corporation stands for. Now, it's not quite that a decade spent there smashed dreams. I think almost all of us continue to carry that flame in our hearts, and sometimes it causes our hearts to ache when the ABC lets us drift in the wind like so much spring pollen. But certainly being on the air every day on the public broadcaster carries with it a unique responsibility that's quite unlike working for a commercial media organisation. And I wanted to examine that for you tonight in light of my personal beliefs and standards in a couple of different ways. The responsibility that we owe to the community, how we approach that in terms of balancing news, ethics, general interest and individual fairness to people. The first thing we need to bear in mind at all times is what will interest and inform the audience. And people need to have interesting content on their radio. It's all very well being worthy and good-hearted about every community event that comes along, every sound good idea, but there's no point if people just turn off the radio. So that means we sometimes need to turn down people who feel that their ABC owes them some coverage for their good work. And it's a tricky relationship to navigate, because what we really need people to give us is interesting material, a fascinating hook, a meaningful story that will catch people's attention for more than its simple worthiness. One of the key ABC editorial guidelines is balance. Our role as the public broadcaster means that we take a reasonable and balanced view of events in specific ways. Now, that is an absolute obligation during defined political campaigns, where our commitment to balance goes as far as literally counting the minutes that politicians spend on air, with a stopwatch, no less. That's what my producer is up to while I'm interviewing someone. And taking notes on all phone calls and offers of time to politicians to avoid them trying to game the available airtime, to be unavailable for weeks and weeks and weeks until the last week of the campaign, when they magically appear and claim their equal allocation. which they do, they really try. There are a few caveats here though on balance. We're not bound, for example, to give equal time to every existing viewpoint, because that in itself would be unbalanced. Neither are we obliged to give equal airtime to every possible different opinion. I had a fascinating experience with this recently. I talk on a regular basis to Professor Simon Foote, who heads up the John Curtin School of Medical Research at the ANU. Simon's a great advocate of scientific rigour, the double-blind trial as the gold standard of scientific investigation, and he does love shooting down myths. So we had a discussion on air one day about acupuncture. Who would have thought that could get you into trouble? And Simon said that while as far as these therapies go, acupuncture does no harm, and if it makes you feel better, by all means seek it out. But he said that in the most rigorously designed double-blind trial, repeated and tested until the results were crystal clear, it was evident that there is absolutely no measurable scientific effect in acupuncture beyond the placebo effect. And his argument was, therefore, it should not be a medical benefit funded by the taxpayer. Well, you would have thought he'd said that there was no Christmas and no Easter bunny. The number of people who were furious because it had made them feel better. And one comment in particular really struck me. It was from an angry person who said something like this, and I quote here loosely, "People like your guest who are so black and white are part of the problem in this country. Get some balance, ABC." And I thought, well, this isn't an opinions competition. This is a highly skilled scientist telling us that on the very best scientific evidence available, something is flat out not true. Now, we do not owe the listeners balance in that situation, when what they're really complaining about is not that we're being unfair to alternative therapy practitioners. What they're really saying is that they don't agree and they don't like it and it's hurt their feelings. So that is a failure of logic on their part, not ethics on mine. Same thing with a recent story about the formula milk market in China. I had a commentator, again very well qualified, citing the World Health Organisation's standards on breastfeeding as the optimum nutrition for babies. And she made the point that while formula is an acceptable substitute when good reasons exist for not breastfeeding, it is not a better choice for babies as it's being marketed in China at the moment. Cue the furious comments, interestingly, mostly from men, saying that their wives had not been able to breastfeed and they took exception to my guest's condescending and patronising tone. Where was our balance? I must have explained carefully 3 times within 15 minutes that my guest was not criticising women for formula feeding. She was stating a well-verified, well-founded, broad public health principle. And that's the constantly fascinating thing about these arguments. People see the world through the prism of their own understanding and their own beliefs. And because it's the ABC, it's your ABC, they expect us to reflect their worldview. And when we don't, they become angry. And instead of seeing the logic of competing valid viewpoints, they believe instead that they see evidence of bias or imbalance on our part instead. And because they believe that they own the ABC and therefore have a right to hear what they want, they don't simply turn off as they would with commercial radio or print media. They decide instead that there is a conspiracy against their majority world view. Because as the world knows, there is no minority more beleaguered than middle-aged white male Canberrans who do most of the complaining. I have found myself thinking about this a great deal this year because of the extensive coverage we've done about domestic violence. Now that's aroused deep anger among a small number of our listeners, deep aggressive anger, to the extent that we actually called the police in to advise on one of them in particular who was very threatening. What happens is this: we talk with experts about the nature of the domestic violence problem. And we talked to a wide range of experts. I've sought them out deliberately, and quite consciously I've actually often sought male experts on domestic violence to give these perspectives. The reality is that while it's not exclusively the case, nevertheless the vast majority of victims of domestic violence are women and children, and the vast majority of perpetrators are men, even when their victims are other men. Now, I've discussed this with the Australian Bureau of Statistics lead criminologists, for example. I've talked to the man who for 15 years ran the Men's Resource Service in Victoria. So I'm pretty sure that they're on the money. But there's an interesting dynamic going on, not simply on 666, but almost everywhere else when this is raised. When the gendered nature of a crime is discussed, it threatens the understanding that some men have that the world's natural order puts them in charge, that anything which questions that worldview also challenges them. They connect that discussion personally with their own experiences, and then they assign blame for this disruption of the natural order to the voice that is asking the questions, those feminist lefties at the ABC. And we become the target of that rage, which is probably really about their own marriages, their own relationships with women, and nothing to do with us at all. It's an invidious circle. My nature is to try to address those concerns honestly. And as I said, I've spoken with every expert we can find who confirm those views of who the victims and the perpetrators are, which is not to say that men are not sometimes victims of domestic violence, or that all men are perpetrators, far from it. But I've learned in these interactions that the exercise of my feelings of responsibility and compassion, the drive I have to make people feel they're heard and understood, is not productive with these people. In fact, I did speak almost accidentally to the chap who caused us most concern, and he revealed that there had been extreme violence in his own family, perpetrated, he said, by his mother against his father. And when I told him that I could hear how much anger and pain he was carrying, and that I was genuinely sorry he had been through such terrible sadness as a child, he was incandescently angry with me. And I concluded the conversation. I said, I am sorry that you've been through that, but it's not my job to provide a mechanism for you to vent that anger. And really, I didn't say this to him, but really, it has nothing to do with me. Now, we do need to think about this question of balance very seriously. A year or two ago, ABC Chair Jim Spiegelman spoke at the Press Club about this very question. And he said that every day he heard ABC journalists working very hard at achieving balance inside the context of their interviews, but not so much with whom they chose to speak. And that's a thought-provoking notion, that we need to establish balance among the people to whom we give our interviews. Although it's a hard one to break through when we work with very limited resources. All too often, the talent that we choose are the people who pick up their phone and say yes at 7:30 in the morning. That's not an easy thing, to walk in and work out what the first 3 stories of the day are going to be, starting at 7 a.m. But can you take a side? Can you exhibit balance in your interview and decide at the same time that something is simply right or simply wrong? Personally, I take great care whenever possible not to allow any personal opinions I might have to slip through. I work quite hard on that. Although I recently heard Fran Kelly from Radio National Breakfast talk about her decision to be opinionated on a couple of major issues. Mabo, also the apology to the stolen generation, to be clear about her belief that these were simply matters of justice. I'm not sure how I feel about that decision, although fundamentally I agree with her views, but it does bring me to how to deal with Catholic matters. Now, these were once very much a sideline in the course of our daily business in the media, but of course in recent times they've become front and centre in the most distressing manner possible. As a general principle, I've never hidden the fact that I'm a practising Catholic, and I think that many regular listeners would have picked that up. However, I've never made a point of declaring it either, and I'm not employed to be an advocate for the Church. I hope and believe that my listeners would not think that I have ever done the Church particular favours because it is the Church. I'm fairly convinced that Father John Woods, bless him, didn't think that when I grilled him over and over again about the Favia House land deal questions and the heritage value of St Patrick's in Braddon. In fact, I met him one day in the Canberra Centre and he groaned and said, "Oh, please make it stop." I said, "Come on, John, we're both doing our job." So first and foremost, my duty is towards the truth. And where sexual abuse matters are concerned, as they have been in the main forefront of the media for the last couple of years, the truth is grim, as we all know, for the Church. It's a history of complicity in abuse at worst, ignorance at best, and a consequent profound loss of trust and faith in the institution that's caused immense distress for those who were of the tribe. My ethical responsibility is to be both fair and to seek the truth, rather than to do the Church a favour by not raising the matter or by asking easy questions. I admired tremendously last year's ACT local hero, whom I interviewed at the time, former Marist student Damien DeMarco, who stood in front of cross-examination at the Royal Commission over his allegations of sexual abuse at the hands of Brother Kostka-Shute, and he was made to answer questions about whether he had heavily used marijuana and other imputations that had little or nothing to do with the truth of his abuse at the Marist brothers' hands and his desperate attempts to stop it from happening to others. That cross-examination, by the way, I think that was genuinely a despicable instruction, and we ought all to be ashamed of that. Speaking this truth, accepting culpability, as Francis Sullivan, whom I also admire tremendously for his bravery in confronting reality, can make some people who hear these stories very angry with us in the media. The assumption is that we, including me, report these matters out of a hatred for the Church and an anti-Catholic prejudice. Now that's not so. I believe the higher call is to tell the truth so that we can all heal, including those of us who remain inside the Church and grapple with this with great difficulty. And my producer does field random calls from people who shout at her about my clear hatred of the Church. I believe that we can also shine a light on how the broader community feels, a matter that also arose this year when a Marici College student, whose mothers are a lesbian couple, organised a march in solidarity with marriage equality and in response to the Church's pamphlet distributed through Catholic schools. Now, I had already given Archbishop Prowse a lengthy interview on the pamphlet at my request, and I commended him, as I always do, for his willingness to front up, to truthfully and faithfully answer hard questions about these matters. But I don't shape or create a response from the audience if they are genuinely very angry about something, as they were with the Church during these interviews. We don't censor or restrict the comments that come through from the audience. So what you hear from the listeners on my program is what they are ringing up or texting to say. It's not crafted to suit any intentions. And if your comment didn't get through, we either ran out of time, found it gratuitously offensive, or could not understand what you were talking about. Now, I think that the degree and depth of that anger over matters like sexual abuse and marriage equality is perhaps surprising for our local church hierarchy. But it's a very genuine and real reflection of how a community like this, and there are deep Catholic roots in Canberra, this is part of that same Irish diaspora augmented by post-war migration from European Catholic countries, but this community feels about what they see as unfair and judgmental exclusion. And we do get so much anger. It's really quite striking. We made a decision last year, for example, to talk to Tim and Lara Kirk about the 2015 Assembly. Hundreds of people were expected at the Assembly, hundreds more were listening online. And when Tim and Lara came into the studio to talk about their faith and how it had guided their lives, Tim's obviously a person of very high profile nationally as a winemaker of the year and someone of great skill and significant profile. It wasn't a token chat. It included questions from me about how they talk to their children about difficult matters within the church when it's all over the headlines. But that too prompted literally a dozen calls from people who are angry that the ABC was even talking to Catholics about Catholicism. Now, if there was an assembly of 800 Buddhists in the ACT, would things have been different? Would we have ignored that because they were Buddhists? We would have jumped at the story and people would have loved it, and they would not have rung up to complain about what the Buddhists are doing to the Rohingyas in Myanmar and how dare we, etc., etc. So it is a hard time to be a Catholic in the media. But I think in the quest for fairness and balance, truth always wins out, and so it should. Sometimes I feel like an undermanned juggling act at the circus, struggling to do my best towards everyone with nowhere near enough time and resources, and damning myself with my deeply rooted instinct to hear people out, to make them all feel that I'm listening and that I care about their concerns. If I were a tougher person, I might spend less time worrying about this, and perhaps I have learned to do that to some degree over the last decade. I've always described myself as a social justice Catholic, and I lean heavily on those values of compassion, justice and mercy above all that I learned from my mother, from my childhood, from the Loreto nuns. They inform everything that I do at work. Sometimes they cripple everything I do at work and exhaust my own resources. But I do offer that service to all of you. Thank you.
Lovely, fantastic address, and I was thinking as Genevieve was describing the skies out at
Kondiala.
And it's very lyrical, so you could just see the clouds passing by. Okay, so let's go to some questions. We'll take a spoken question off the floor, and if you have any written questions, please pass them through.
I'm very used to the talk back, so off you go. Yes?
Could you stand up and just introduce yourself?
Just curious, how difficult is it to actually do an interview where you are thoroughly opposed to what it is that the person you're interviewing is actually saying?
It's an interesting question if it's difficult to interview somebody to whose ideas you are thoroughly opposed, and I've had that experience a number of times. I had a really interesting interview last year. You might remember that there's a proposal for an Islamic cemetery at Marulan, and there were protests in Belmore Park in Goulburn, people carrying banners about Sharia law and halal food and so on and so forth. Now, as it turned out, in the end, Goulburn Council turned down the cemetery proposal on the grounds of a whole lot of environmental and planning issues which were perfectly valid, but it was clear to me that the group running the protest were basically racist, prejudiced thugs. And I got the chat on the radio, and I've come to understand over the years there's a difference between approaches on the radio, and there's a temptation when you're first on air to sort of beat people down and to whack them about the head and prove how clever and how assertive you are. And I might just sort of comment there parenthetically on the difference between male and female radio presenters, because that's what the blokes do. They say, "Come on, how stupid of you," and they talk right over the top of you. It's an interesting observation that generally behaviour that the listeners accept from men they find very troubling in women. And what I've learnt, and what actually works better with my nature in any case, is to be just very calm and very patient and very methodical and listen very carefully to what someone is saying. So in the case of this chap on the radio, I asked him specifically and in detail exactly what his objections were. And he was unclear and muddled about the environmental and planning objections. But then we got to the issue of religion, and he said to me, "Well, I think, the other thing is that we all know what the elephant in the room is." And I said, "Could you tell me what the elephant in the room is?" He said, "Oh, don't be so stupid, everyone recognises the elephant in the room." And I said, "No, I want you to tell me exactly what the elephant in the room is." And so by patient questioning, he spluttered, he got very angry. I think he hung up on us in the end, and I had not been rude to him for a moment. I had just patiently, analytically, carefully pushed him towards essentially being forced to admit that he didn't like people because they were Muslims. And so it's a technique that you can hone. I think if you lose your temper, I think you can be clear and have common sense, but I think if you lose your temper, you've lost the game, where people are wrong, or they are simply ignorant, or they're presenting a viewpoint that's not sustainable. But it's a difficult art to perfect. And you can look it up in the interview, I had a tremendous run-in with John Pilger last year. We got John Pilger up to talk at very late notice about his film Utopia, with the absolute honest and open intention of talking to him about the film. Now, nobody pretended it was a review, and he knew that the phone call had been made at 8:30 in the morning for an interview at 9:30, and that I'd been on air from 9 o'clock. And he immediately tackled me vehemently about whether I'd seen the film. And I said no. And I said, I haven't. I live in the country. I haven't been to the cinema. We've only just sort of set this up. And he really attacked me. He really went for me, clearly because it was an opportunity for him to cast me as one of the complicit media who refused to run his story because we're inherently racist. Now, this isn't a racist audience. 666 is not filled with redneck racist listeners. It's filled with people who are aware and sympathetic and curious and genuine in their interest. So I was being used by Mr. Pilger, and in the end, I simply pulled the fader down and I said, well, live radio, what can you do about it? Thank you very much. And he then whipped it up further into a frenzy by going to Media Watch and saying we'd refused to give him the transcripts and we were deliberately suppressing his viewpoint, after he'd shouted at me for a good 5 minutes. It was a most extraordinary thing. The next day, one of the listeners sent me flowers, which was lovely. I've never heard such a rude, ignorant bully in my life. So it's actually quite, when those sorts of things happen to you, it's actually quite emotionally harrowing. It's really very difficult when someone you've never met is very, very angry with you for you doing nothing other than your job. But that's one of the things that we need to take with it. Yeah, that's other questions? Someone else who'd like to? Yes.
Genevieve P. Mackay, I commend you for putting up with human nature the way it is. And one of the, before I get on to my main question, and it seems to me that we're responding so quickly that the issue of anger rises far quicker rather than a considered response. And I just wonder whether in fact radio is encouraging that even more so with the use of Twitter and tweets, which generally I do not see when they're read out, that they are there to build up or to encourage. Generally they are quite negative, it doesn't matter which side, etc. Can you comment on that, and is there a way that we can turn it back a little bit, perhaps go back to radio and not just read out these uncensored
It's an interesting question, certainly, and Father Julian and I were just discussing this before we began this evening. Certainly the immediacy of communication leads people to say things that they might afterwards regret. And there is no doubt that also radio is a very intimate form of communication, and people believe that they know you very well indeed. In fact, I had a lovely experience just a couple of days ago. I went to the Smith family's thank you lunch, and the receptionist at the law firm where it was being held stepped out as I got into the lift. She said, "Oh, I'm terribly excited to meet you. I saw your name on the guest list. I've only been a listener since my husband retired. I never listened to radio before, but I think you're wonderful. I don't agree with you all that much though." And that means I talk back at you a fair bit. She said, "But I love the experience." That's great. That's actually terrific to have that kind of interaction. And I think people do often respond too quickly in their direct communication and forget that there's a person at the other end, that there's a human being trying to do their job to the best of their abilities, and that perhaps the anger that they have is about something else entirely. So we do certainly leave out the personally sort of the gratuitous, the offensive. But I also find on 666, and perhaps I think this is definitely not the case on sort of Alan Jones or Ray Hadley perhaps, but I do find that if I read out something particularly offensive or stupid, all I've got to do is read it out in a very even tone and allow the listeners to respond. And that works an absolute treat. And, we had someone a while ago who texted to complain about the clicking noise. And they said, "You're obviously not paying any attention to your interview, and it's incredibly rude that you're just scrolling through pages on the internet. What are you up to?" And now, look, I've got 5 computer screens in front of me in that studio. I've got 7 tabs on one computer screen and 5 tabs on the other. And I can't do my job without clicking through to tell you what the weather is and what the texts are and what the tweets are and various other things, and to find what my producer is saying to me. So I sort of read this out, and the deluge of people saying, "Get a life, you stupid Burke." And so sometimes the audience, I find the audience in Canberra is intelligent enough to do the job a great deal of the time in any case. And I have learned to kind of take things with something of a grain of salt. I also had a memorable question from someone not long ago who said, did I think it was possible with wind farms that the wind farms would suck up all the available energy and that we would therefore lose it from the earth? And I read that one out in a respectful tone as well. I did say, I don't think it quite works like that. But then, yes, the listeners sort of weighed in on that. So I see it as a sort of an interaction and a conversation. But I would say that on ABC Radio, certainly, we are not generally trying to whip people up into a confrontational frenzy, unlike commercial talkback radio. And we could do it. I mean, I could start every day talking about pedestrians and cyclists and who's got the right on the road. And we could just all hit each other for about an hour on the radio. But we generally try not to do that. So yes, so did you have a supplementary question?
No, but I'll think of one.
Okay.
Thank you for the offer.
That's okay. Other questions? Right down the back. Yep.
Oh, hi, Amber. Love to hear your voice in person. It sounds just the same. Lovely voice. Just as a practicing Catholic myself as well, with all the sexual abuse and in the media and everything going on, you feel that people who are so anti that they're blaming the individual Catholic. Have you got any advice on how to move forward with those sort of people, you know, that say, oh, I left the church because this and this and this happened, and we say, well, you know, that's your journey, or, you know, have you got any advice how to even speak to those people? Because I imagine you're speaking with them quite often.
Oh, absolutely. And I think actually I had this discussion with Francis Sullivan one day on the phone as we've been through the Royal Commission hearings here in Canberra, and I rang him and I said, Francis, I know Francis quite well. I said, Francis, I would just like you to come in and talk to us who have the church in our history, have the church in our DNA, who may be practising, who may be lapsed, because in some senses I feel the easy way, and I don't mean for a moment that this is not valid for people, but the easy way is to walk away, to say I'm so disgusted and this is so abhorrent and it's so repulsive, and people I know have been so badly hurt that I can no longer have anything to do with that institution. But there are those of us, and I presume that's us here in this hall, who feel all of those things and are still here within. And it is hard to justify that position. And certainly, let me tell you, the ABC is crawling with Catholics. It is jammed. It's not just me and Geraldine Dude. It is crammed to the gills with mostly somewhat lapsed Catholics and people who believe that they have good reason to have left the church and to be quite angry with the church. I don't know how to answer that question other than to say, tell me what's caused you that pain. Let me listen. Let me listen to what you have been through and why you feel the way you do. And I feel that open questions often cause people to examine their own thoughts and their own hearts as much as anything else. So to affirm the reality of those people's anger and pain, to stand with them in solidarity for someone who has been abused, perhaps often they've had a family member who's gay who feels terribly excluded and judged, their child or they themselves or someone in their family has been abused at the hands of a priest. And I think the very important starting point is to acknowledge the reality of the pain and to not ever jump into excuse-making mode. And really, excuse-making mode is what we've seen a very great deal of within the church hierarchy. So we need to simply say, I am a person of belief, but I am primarily compassionate and loving towards you in your suffering, and that the way I live my faith is the best message that I can give to you. And I think that in almost everything, that's the best thing you can do. Say, look at how I act out of my values and my beliefs, and let that be the message, rather than entering into the rights and wrongs of what happened to you. But I think that this is a crisis, and I've got actually Pat Power and Bishop Bill Morris on the radio tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I've got a great promo running. I've got two bishops walking into a radio studio. You have to find out the punchline yourself. But that's one of the questions that I'll have for them. How long do you think it will take to rebuild some kind of trust and faith in this institution? And it must be a very different kind of trust and faith, because the old way is gone forever after all this suffering. But I have no better answers other than to listen with an open heart. And I've heard some horrendous stories on the radio, absolutely horrendous. Okay, other questions? Yeah. Hello, Vivian.
I just wanted to ask, because there is different religions, and there is a feeling quite strongly that by spiritual people that we should be moving towards a feeling of both and rather than either or. It strikes me that in your environment you're very much placed with black and white dualistic thinking. And how do you actually, is it worth trying to promote that rather more?
I think, Vivian, I spend a great deal of my time on the radio saying things like, oh, it's very complex, isn't it? And I often think, oh, gee, you're hedging your bets. But look, I think that that's absolutely one of the important roles for me as a journalist, is to be able to tease out the complexity of issues and to illustrate. I think my belief is that generally people are acting in their best possible interests and at their best capacity. We have to believe that of our leaders and all of those around us. We have every right to call that into question, but it's very rarely the case that anything is absolutely black and white. And take, for example, this awful case we've had of the child in the cage, the autistic child who was restrained. Now, it's clear that that was a terrible outcome and it should never have been allowed to happen. But as the inquiry has sort of unfolded and we've finally got the results on that, it's also clear that people felt that they had no other options, that they were abandoned, that people who were essentially good people, as in both teachers and school staff, felt they did not know what else they could do, that they're faced with a child whose behaviour was incredibly challenging. Now, that child's human rights were, severely compromised by the treatment that was meted out. But I feel that it's not very productive to say on the radio, well, it's all your fault, isn't it? And I agree that that's very much a temptation in talkback radio to present things in a black and white manner, because then you stir up one proportion of the population and the other proportion of the population says, oh, that's absolutely right. But it can't be like that. Although I do find that when I'm asking questions, this always happens after the budget, the morning after the budget. You've got various politicians on, various sort of people on to respond to it. And inevitably, several people text in to suggest that you are clearly a Labor stooge or a Liberal troll. Now we always feel quite good about ourselves if we get that pretty much evenly balanced. But again, it goes back to that sort of question of people seeing the world through the framework of their own inherent beliefs. And if we can bring them to see things as complex matters, multifaceted matters, then that's one of the things that I do see very much as my role on the radio, to tease out the inherent issues, to encourage people to see different viewpoints, to encourage people to hear from the heart of those who are involved about the thought that they've put into an issue, the decisions they came to, perhaps the errors they acknowledge. I quite often say to people, well, would you do it differently? If something else was, if you had more time or if another factor was at play, would you do it differently? And it's great if people say, oh yes, I might change my mind actually, I wouldn't take that approach again. So it's part of fostering discussion rather than laying down the law, I think. Right down the back there, and then I'll come to you. Yeah.
Bit louder. You used to tell these editors, if it doesn't upset somebody, it's not you. I guess that just led me on directly to the question. Too delicate. On the ABC, are ratings an issue? And if the ratings drifted somewhere, did you argue expected to respond to that?
Well, that's actually a very interesting question. The answer is both yes and no. So the ABC in Canberra is subject to 3 ratings per year. And look, I can tell you a little bit of pride that you're looking at the #1 mornings presenter in Canberra. expected actually, and I'm sure that once Mix 106 get their act together, people will go back to listening to hits from the 80s. But anyway, so ratings are an issue, but at the ABC we tend to look at them not in the way they do on commercial radio, which is where you live or die, and certainly in Sydney, where they're on an almost continual ratings examination. They have, I think, 7 or 9 sets of ratings a year rather than the 3 we have. The ups and the downs are minutely passed and analysed. So what we look at in the ABC is the general trend. And so for some years now, ABC Breakfast has been number 1 in the market, and ABC itself, 666 ABC, has been number 1 in the market. So it's fantastic to be part of that picture. And what that indicates to us is not sort of the precise sort of fluctuations of 1 or 2 points in any direction, but more that the trend is that we're generally getting it right with this audience. And I always think that the ABC and Canberra is just an absolute perfect fit. It's a lock fit. We've got a community that is very responsive to the kind of radio that we make. We respond to their needs. It's an intelligent, well-informed audience. It's a very responsive, thoughtful audience. I always remember a story years ago on afternoons. I don't know whether any of you remember this. There was a boy who drowned in the Murrumbidgee River, and there was a memorial set up by his friends at the Woden bus interchange. And you know the kind of thing, it's sort of mouldering teddy bears and guttering candles and vague obscenities sort of written on the walls of the bus interchange. And after about sort of 3 or 4 days of this, TAMS stepped in and very tactfully suggested that it might be time to move on in the interests of the thousands of people per day tripping over the teddy bears in the Woden bus interchange. And we did a story about this. And I thought to myself, now, if we were sort of pursuing ratings in Sydney, if we were driven by this kind of thing, and I was on talkback radio, on commercial radio, you'd turn this one on and people would ring up and say, young people today are a bloody disgrace and they don't know they're born and in my time and what we need is conscription and so on and so forth. Anyway, we did get talkback. We got about 3 or 4 calls from people saying things like, look, I feel that the young of today haven't understood the process of grief and they're in an unresolved phase where perhaps they need counselling. And that was the solution from the listeners of Canberra, that TAMS should send out grief counsellors. Which is probably pretty solid, actually. But in terms of what the listeners expect from us and ratings and how we are driven by that, what we think the listeners want from us is an energetic, well-informed, very well-connected local discussion. And for me, it's very much about being local. It's very much about understanding what matters in this community. It's about knowing where things are and what's happening. I mean, I note, and I don't sort of actually wish to sort of slag them off or criticise them, but the 2 new 104 breakfast presenters, one's from Toowoomba and the other one's from Wollongong. And I think to myself, well, the first time you mispronounce Waniassa, the first time you ask where the valley is or in which direction the Barton Highway heads, you know, that's not what we do. We connect with our community, and if we're getting that right, then that's obviously reflected in the ratings, and it seems that we are, which is good for us. Now, I think we had a question over here. Yeah.
Yes, can I say that I remember you from the gardening show.
Oh. Sorry. You might have heard on the gardening show, I used to say quite often, I'd say, look, what I think you should do is prune out the dead wood, give it a really good mulch of loosen hay, loosen up the soil a bit and water it and see how it looks in the spring. Really can't go wrong with that as advice. Go on.
You touched on balance, I think you touched on it several times. I'm just curious if you can stand a bit on the criteria you look for to trigger on a student that produces a program and I guess it's not just a popularity contest, it's something.
Look, it's an interesting question and one that's exercised us very particularly with regard to climate change. And because there is a very noisy number of people who are climate change denialists, for example, and we've had to examine our question of balance very, very carefully in how we deal with this, because the accusation is that the ABC is only interested in presenting a certain view. Now, climate change is a very good example of the balance question, because when we look at that, we know unmistakably that the overwhelming scientific consensus is that climate change is both real and anthropogenic, that it's man-made. And that is what we need to reflect, not the fact that there are multiple competing points of view. We should give note to the fact that those competing points of view exist, and it would not be wrong of us to give them some airtime, but it would be completely unbalanced of us when we're dealing with climate change to have on a senior scientist from the ANU, say someone like Professor Will Steffen or someone like that, and to then seek balance by seeking somebody who did not believe in climate change. That's not balance, in fact. That's merely the representation of multiple competing points of view. So what we look for when we're examining balance is where majority opinions lie, where other substantial opinions lie. When we're looking at politics, for example, and we're in an election campaign, similarly, if I were to give time on air to every party that's running, those characteristics of the ACT elections where you've got the warm, sun-dried tomato party and, people who don't believe in Christmas and all sorts of things like that. If we were to ask all of those candidates their opinions at all times, then that would also be unbalanced, because the reality is that we've got a couple of major political parties in Australia and certainly in the Assembly, and so what we need to pay attention to is that we give Labor and Liberals, and to some extent the Greens, the majority of airtime, and that we balance that out fairly, because that reflects the vote in the ACT. And that we also acknowledge those other parties and their existence and their viewpoints, that we're aware of them, and we're particularly aware of this sort of steam gathering under one candidate or another or a particular movement, and that we acknowledge that as a reflection of the community. But it's a really tricky thing to achieve. It's not at all easy. And as I suggested, you are very open to accusations that you're playing favourites when people feel that you don't get it right. But certainly in an election campaign, as I said, we have someone sitting with a stopwatch measuring it minute by minute and making extensive diary notes about who we approach and why and how. And that leads to one of my favourite principles on mornings, which is that unless it's absolutely necessary, we don't talk to the politicians, because it's just easier that way. Also, the size of the Assembly. I mean, we could talk to Simon Corbell 5 times a day if we felt like it, and there are so few of them running the place. And so my feeling about that is that it is far better in general to talk to the people affected by decisions, the groups who have got an interest in them, the competing sort of community viewpoints, rather than to frame things in political terms, because it's just not very good radio. It's a bit boring as well. Yes, supplementary question.
You're a consummate communicator, and you tend to respond a lot, and you're a conduit for lots of opinions. But if you were able to run the show without direction, what would be the top 3 subjects that you would push?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Look, I am someone who responds, absolutely, and in some senses it's quite hard to answer that question because I do run the show in lots of ways. One of the things about the ABC is that I've never received an editorial direction in my life. Nobody has ever told me to cover a story in a certain way, or to choose a story or not to choose a story. I don't think I've ever had that conversation in a decade. And I haven't heard anyone else having that conversation at 666 either. So that's simply not something that happens. We do get that free rein to choose stories as we want, and obviously we need to respond to the community in order to achieve that connection with them that we have. I don't really know how to answer that other than to say it wouldn't be terribly different to what it is now. When I took on the job first with the ABC, my youngest child was 9, and I was very conflicted about what to do because it meant leaving her at home on the farm at Cootamundra with her father and her grandmother over the paddock and her aunt and uncle over the paddock in the other direction, and she was 9, during the week. And I had a wonderful friend who said, look, firstly, certainly on the maternal guilt thing, there are people who have to put their babies in full-time daycare at 6 weeks of age, so the fact that you've got the 9-year-old with her father should be okay. But she also said to me, you've got a chance to be a messenger. And I suppose, in a sense, what I am able to do is to bring forward things that I do care about a great deal. Now, for me, particularly with the loss of our rural reporter on 666, for me, it's to pay attention to the fact that Canberra is not run out of the inner north, that I'm broadcasting to hundreds of thousands of people across a broad swathe of southern New South Wales, and that I need to pay heed to things that are happening in Gunning and things that are happening in Bregbo and things that are happening in Yass and Queanbeyan and things that are happening in Tuggeranong and Gungahlin as well. And so that's one of the things that I very much crusade for, that recognition of a broad sweep of the listenership and understanding all of their issues. Beyond that, really the show is actually just run by the two of us. We're always very amused when people ring and they say, I want you to send one of your team down. And Georgia and I just look at each other as there is no team. It's just the two of us making each other cups of tea and getting through the day. So our resources actually at 666 are very limited in very many ways, and one of the things that means is that there isn't a great process of winnowing out ideas and working out exactly what's what. Mostly we are working on what we want to present and what our instinct tells us is the right thing. And I don't think the program would be particularly different. I'd probably never talk about finance. I know that matters to lots of people, but I'd probably never mention finance again because it bores me rigid. That's about it. Yes, here.
Dennis, I've got a supplementary on that one in terms of, can you tell us a bit about your day? You don't just rock up to the studio when you turn on and say, I'm Genevieve James. Can you tell us about your day, preparation beforehand, and what happens after?
Oh no, we just stroll in and I'm given a script. Yeah, right. No, look, actually that's a very good question, Dennis. We start our day between 6:30 and 7 to go on air at 9, and we usually finish at around about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I come into work. What we've usually done the day before is to set up as much of the program as we can, but leave space for breaking news. So the remit for mornings is to open up the discussion on news of the day and then to move on to things that are more sort of perhaps what we might call magazine-style discussions, longer discussions, more involved discussions that aren't as sort of sharp and incisive as the breakfast brief. But we'll often take something that breakfast has looked at say 7 o'clock and then think, can we expand that? Can we open that up and discuss that more freely and at more length? So we come in at 6:30. We've got probably the first two stories of the day open. We start by looking at what breakfast has done. We should pay attention to what Drive has done the day before in case there's something that we need to follow up from there. So we'll look through the rundowns. We'll look through the internal ABC news log, which is called iNews, and which lists all the stories, but very briefly. It doesn't give us contacts or anything like that. It just gives us ideas. And that's very often where I'll start. I am in the fortunate position of having quite a few people contact us with ideas for stories and things they think we should have a look at or things they'd like us to follow up on. And Georgia, my producer, who's got a fantastic sort of news instinct, is also really good at following up on things with people and, saying, we'd like you to come in and talk about. And we had Dr. Clark Jones, who's a national terrorism expert at the ANU, and he's just been overseas. And Georgia had said to him before he left, come back when you finish and tell us what you found at that terrorism roundtable in Canada. So we've got that kind of follow through. We'll read the Canberra Times. My thing is not to follow the Canberra Times if I possibly can. They get very cross with us if we do, and it's just not worth it. But I would use their stories as a sort of a springboard perhaps for other ideas we might be able to develop. So that will sort of cover the half hour of broadcasting between 9 and 9:30, or possibly up until about 9:45. After that, we'll have ideas that we've developed up the day before. There's a whole sort of plethora of ideas that come through. You could be the publicity arm with Allen and Unwin by doing book reviews just about every day if you wanted to. And I choose to do books when I really like them and I'm really interested in them and I really want to do it, and I think there's a worthwhile discussion to be had. But we also like finding ideas, and we'll workshop these often after we get off air, that come out of our own real life experiences. So just interesting things that have happened to us or prompts for ideas and discussions. So tomorrow on the radio, for example, at 20 to 10, I've got a panel that we assembled with Diana Abdul Rahman of young Muslims in Canberra. And that came out of a conversation I had with Diana a day or two after the Paris bombing attacks. And Diana said to me in the course of the conversation on radio, she said, look, I feel enormous pressure, and I am a middle-aged, well-educated community leader with a very clear sense of my identity and my place in this community, and I feel terribly pressured by what I hear coming as the consequence of terrorist attacks. And she said, imagine how the young people feel. imagine how the newly arrived migrant Muslim youth feel. And so out of that, Georgia said to me afterwards, well, let's follow up on that. So we've got 3 young Muslims whom Diana has got together for us, who will all come in and talk about what it feels like to be a young Muslim in this community, in this country, what their experiences are, what they go through or don't go through on a daily basis, who supports them, who criticises them. So we'll develop up our ideas like that. After we get off air at 11 o'clock, we drink a lot of tea on mornings. I know journalists are always going to get coffee, but we just make tea all the time, and quite often we cook biscuits for each other. So we'll have a cup of tea, we'll have a biscuit, we have lunch about midday, there are editorial meetings and staff meetings, but we are just working constantly to try to stay ahead of ourselves, because otherwise it's just a nightmare when you've got to come in and there aren't enough things in the rundown, and it's like there's a chasm opening in front of you. And I don't want to do radio that way. I want to be prepared and organised and to see things ahead of time. But yeah, there are only the 2 of us doing it. So any sort of sense that we're part of a media behemoth with immense resources it couldn't be more wrong. It's sort of a daily juggle. But yeah, it's hard work and it's exhausting. And quite often I'm off doing other things at night and working on that as well. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Probably the most articulate woman who's ever arrived in the 30 or 40 years we've had in ABC. So
Thank you.
Unfortunately, my brother doesn't share that view and won't listen to the ABC because he believes that it does in fact breach those things of balance and so on, and points to the fact that you have Kerry O'Brien and Barry Cassidy, both senior staffers of the Labor Party, both Labor Prime Ministers and stuff, as significant presenters. How can they be balanced and truthful, whatever? How do you respond to that?
Well, they don't work for the Labor Party, and I think we have any number of other present politicians who are previous present Liberal politicians. In fact, Sarah Henderson, who's the member for Corangamite, who's been all over the media today on White Ribbon Day, is a Liberal MP in Victoria and is a former very senior ABC presenter. I think that we can't say to people, you can never have any political opinion and work for the ABC ever again. I don't think we can do that. And I think that everyone has a right to their own opinions. Those opinions should not intrude on what they do on air. And I think that it is a cardinal sin if people allow those opinions to intrude on air and they result in an imbalanced approach as a result. But I think that there's an enormous interplay these days between politics and the media. And certainly the press gallery is full of people who used to work for politicians and vice versa. And you know, there's an enormous crossover there, and I think it would be almost impossible to bar people from any kind of on-air position because they'd had political allegiances. I mean, it's a point that's often made. Every time I have Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute on, someone says, why don't you reveal your true allegiance? And Richard said, I've never been a member of a political party in my life. He said, I used to work for the Democrats 15 years ago, but he's not a member of a political party. I had a priceless thing not long ago when I had Anne Henderson on talking about something to do with the Liberal Party post the last prime ministerial changeover, and someone wrote a sort of vicious text suggesting that she was failing to reveal her political allegiances, and I realised they were mixing her up with Heather Henderson, Robert Menzies' daughter. And I had to say, no, you've got the wrong Henderson. But, you know, I think that we need to examine that as carefully as we can on a constant basis within the ABC, and let me assure you that it's done with absolute soul-harrowing regularity on the question of balance of all kinds. We examine ourselves on the balance of gender. We're constantly talking about diversity and whether we represent the kind of community that we are broadcasting to. And that's one of those things where, you know, I certainly never expected in my life to receive any benefit from being a seventh generation Anglo-Celt, but I didn't ever expect that it might be a disadvantage either. But, you know, I've got nothing to offer apart from being a woman. So it's a question that is of almost constant attention within the ABC itself. But as I say, I don't think we can fairly bar intelligent, articulate, highly skilled people on the basis of them having once worked for a political party. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Genevieve.
Just a quick one. You often have people in the studio,
Yeah.
and then you often interview people like via
On the phone or in the TARDIS.
yeah. Because is it completely different? Like, do you attack that from a different point of view? Because seeing a person, like, the first time I saw you in real life was, I think you were the MC for the Pope's Mass years ago.
Yeah, that was me. That was me up on the stage in the freezing cold in front of the thousands. Yes, exactly.
So, like, from a practical point of view, is it different?
Look, I do actually always say to people, if there's a chance, could you come into the studio? And people often presume that that'll be really frightening. And we say to them, actually, it's much better if you do. Because if you come into the studio, radio is such an intimate medium. If you come into the studio, it's just me sitting there. And people get very nervous. They think, oh, God, I might say something stupid and you're going to really grill me. And look, overwhelmingly, we're not. Overwhelmingly, we're talking to you because you're an intelligent, thoughtful person with something to contribute on the matter. And the people who get grilled know they're going to get grilled because it's their job to get grilled. And you know, I have the greatest respect for the ones who sort of stand up to it very well. And I must say, probably of all the politicians of the current lot, Shane Rattenbury's willingness to come into the studio and patiently, calmly, thoughtfully answer questions without losing his temper is just fantastic. It's really wonderful and not a gift given to that many of the rest of them, I must say. So it is different. When you're in the studio, it's better because you're looking them in the eye, you're connecting with them, you are making a conversation that's very much between the two of you that hopefully transcends the barriers of you know, any other kinds of difference that might be at play. But we'll take them however we can get them. Really, just to get them on air. And the TARDIS, for those of you who are wondering, there is a TARDIS network around Australia. And we had great fun recently when Peter Capaldi, who's now playing Doctor Who, came into the ABC, and that meant he had to go into a TARDIS. Fantastic, yep.
Let's say if you had